Okay, so video for Cancer rising. We're starting off here with the symbol for Cancer, which is, I must admit, it's usually a crab, but I'm using an older woodcut associated with it, where it's a kind of a crawfish or crayfish. If you're Australian, it could be a yabby or maybe even a lobster. But the basic idea is a kind of little crustacean guy. Um, and I kind of associate this with, if you think about if you ever go on a beach and you're wading around where the tide pools are, often you'll pick up a rock and find little crabs underneath it, and there's sort of just the attitude of having your own kind of home little nook or cranny that you kind of hide out in, like under a rock, and you're they're kind of comfortable in your own territory, in your own little area. Um, this sort of has to do with Cancer as a moon ruled sign, and the topics of the moon associating with your little environment that you live in, and your needs for the creature comforts of caring for your creature comforts in your own little environment is, I think, kind of comes out in the Cancer symbolism. Since we're doing Hellenistic astrology, I think it would be incomplete to talk about Cancer rising without having a discussion about the Thema Mundi. The Thema Mundi is based on a kind of a creation myth where they're saying that when the universe or the world was created, it was created at a certain point in time, where all the planets basically were in their own domicile signs. Um, and I think that's the main importance of the Thema Mundi, is that it represents the basic planetary rulership scheme. Um, and Of course, though, you most of the planets rule two signs. So this is, with the Thema Mundi, they're only in one half of the chart because the planets can't be two places at once. And for whatever reason, we've got it starting with Cancer as the ascendant, and then in succession going towards the seventh house. So planets at each place on the lower part of the chart, so under the horizon. Um, the the top of the chart, which is empty, would be a kind of a mirroring of these planets. Um, the Cancer and Leo is kind of the exception because the mirroring happens between the sun and the moon here. But if you were to think of the opposite side, opposite to the sun and the moon are two Saturn signs, and then this is all laid out actually by the distance the planets have to the sun. Mercury is the closest orbit to the sun, so it's never really going to get farther away than one sign from the sun. So you have Mercury there, one sign away from the sun. Then you've got Venus, two signs. Second farthest away, third farthest away is Mars. You can see Mars is there, and then Jupiter, and so it follows this pattern of the distance from the sun, which I think is nice to look at because that gives you kind of have an eye into the rationale of how the rulership scheme has been laid out, and perhaps the whole thing of the Cancer as the ascendant. I'm just kind of speculating here, but it creates an interesting kind of reflective quality, really. Like if you think about like the ocean, if you had like something on the horizon, it would be reflected in the water. So if you had, let's say, um, over, you had Saturn setting. If it was a perfectly still water, you'd see Saturn reflected below the horizon on the water, perhaps, right? Um, And so there's this kind of reflective quality of the thema mundi, and I think that's kind of interesting. The other thing that's been pointed out is that with Mars ruled sign Aries in the 10th, that is the exaltation of the sun, and so you have exalted sun at the kind of the noon point of the chart, whereas the nadir or the IC is Libra, which would be the exaltation of Saturn. I would say if you're gonna completely match, the signs kind of represent a seasonal quality, where Aries represents the spring and Libra represents the start of the fall. I think it would be maybe more appropriate if, let's say, for example, a Libra ruled chart or a Libra ascendant, then Libra would be the or you would have Cancer there on the 10th, representing the fullness, the fullest time of day, the fullest time of the year in terms of daylight, and then the winter as representing the very bottom of the underworld there. But the thing is, I guess it's also kind of interesting because they move in different motions, right? The houses rotate in one direction, whereas the planets and the signs move in another. This is the secondary versus the primary motion. Um, I don't know. It's sort of a complicated thing to get into. Here we've got winter Saturn ruled signs being at the setting or the descendant. And then perhaps that makes sense. I don't know. With without spending too much time on the thema mundi, I'll just say that I think the basic importance of it is the rulership scheme, but the significance of having it specifically with Cancer as the ascendant, I'm not sure if there's a totally agreed upon interpretation of this, but I think this is perhaps one of the more interesting and perhaps even mysterious things about studying ancient astrology, is that we can kind of look into this and ponder it, and it's kind of open to interpretation of what does it really mean that the thema mundi has this specific placement with Cancer on the ascendant. And I think, as I was going into earlier, there could be some significance with how Aries matches with the 10th, how Libra matches with the 4th, how Cancer matches with the 7th, and these different angular positions matching with these cardinal signs. But it gets a bit complicated, though, with the interplay between primary motion and secondary motion, and that's a lot to get into, so I'm just going to kind of leave it there. But I don't think, however, if we keep scrolling over here, I don't think that there's anything necessarily dignified about the rulership of these signs when you match them up to the scheme of the planetary joys, because as you see in this chart, they don't really match up in any way at all. You've got Mercury, joy of the first house, matching with the moon. You've kind of got the inverse thing happening in the third. You've got a Mars ruled sign in the joy of Venus. You've got a Jupiter ruled sign in the joy of Mars. There's not really any connection here at all in this sense, anyways. So I won't spend much time on here because there's not really. I don't think there's really much to really say. As we scroll over here, I've tried to do a kind of like a little infographic. Before, I was just kind of sketching this out on note paper. This is my attempt to do it with emojis and such. Just I don't know. This looks a bit sloppy. I might have to fix this up a bit. I don't know if I'll do this for the next one. I'm just sort of. But yeah, it gives you an idea, kind of a visualization of the symmetry. And I was talking about there's a kind of a mirroring that happens, and it's almost as if you were looking at if you're looking at a rainbow reflected on the ocean, where the rainbow meets the horizon, it would create this kind of mirror image, and we're almost seeing that kind of image here, with that kind of Saturn marking a horizon point. And And I was kind of getting a bit into that when I was reflecting on the thema mundi there. So I think that's kind of like perhaps an interesting thing as an image to kind of ponder on, the kind of symmetrical, reflective quality of the rulership scheme. And we can see this in the lichen girding, and each of these kinds of colored beams are representing the link. Here we have between the 3rd and the 12th house with Mercury, for example, or the 4th and the 11th with Venus, etc. If we were to look at Cancer as a sign in the first and understand its meaning, first I'd start with understanding the meaning of the moon as its ruler. The moon is seen as a kind of a feminine principle compared to the sun as a masculine principle, and the sun and moon have been used as general significators for the mother and father. So that's where the theme of the mother, the nurturing, mothering quality of Cancer comes from, is the moon and its association with motherhood. The moon also is a general kind of yin principle to the yang of the sun, being that the sun emits light, whereas the moon receives and reflects the light of the sun. And this sort of receptive quality comes out in the kind of the water quality of Cancer as a sign, as being the sensitive, receiving the information, whether that's emotional sensitivity or sensitivity to different stimulus in the environment. And also, the moon is also a significator for the body, and we can see that, for one thing, there's a strong connection between the moon and the menstrual cycle. We can also relate it to pregnancy as well, with the filling of the moon being as the kind of the coming to term of pregnancy, as well as just in general any of the waxing and waning of the moon. If you think about even our breathing and our circulatory system, we're always breathing in and out. We're always either eating food or else eliminating it. There's this kind of this rhythm. There's the rhythm of sleep, of like going to sleep and then getting up, night and day, and this kind of pulse or this rhythm as the kind of the rhythm of the lunar cycle. So that is kind of emphasized with the moon, and I think that is kind of emphasized as well when you're looking at the topics of the first house. The first house, for one thing, has to do with the body, as a kind of, you get the sense of the person as an individual. They're kind of, we get who you are. Your person is kind of your body, your physical person. That it could be emphasized by the moon, and the style of the person's character in terms of navigating their life and the choices they make, because the first house is considered to be the helm, or it's kind of like the steering wheel of the chart. And if we go back to what I was saying about the emotional, the receptive quality, the emotional sensitivity, that could be, operating, making choices and whatnot based on the gut feelings, the intuitive hunches. Gabor Mate talks a lot about this in terms of, have you ever had like a gut feeling about something and didn't follow through on it, and then kind of regret it later? That the wisdom of the higher wisdom speaks through us, not through our mental capacity, but through like this deep kind of gut feeling. And I think our society has kind of taken a kind of a bias against this, and it's kind of interesting to look at it with astrology, because astrology, through this kind of archetypal alphabet, connects this sort of intuitive gut wisdom capacity as a kind of a more feminine principle, whereas the kind of rational intellect is a more masculine principle. And this isn't, there's could be all these gender stereotypes about men being more this way and women being more like that, but in reality, men and women both have these different capacities. Maybe it'd be kind of interesting though that if a lot more women seem to be into the stuff like tarot and astrology, and there is something of the feminine wisdom that comes out in the intuitive arts, you could say, but that it's not as well respected as this very clinical, analytical, deductive, rationalistic, scientific kind of thing, which we associate as being more yang. And I think there's a kind of like an inherent bias in this. And I like what the Taoists have to say, because in the Tao Te Ching they say that the way is to know the masculine but abide with the feminine, that to take the more of the yin approach to things, to get in tune with that kind of gut wisdom, that deeper intuitive receptivity, and the listening, rather than getting caught up in the ramblings of the mind, this, which would be maybe associate, Mercury is more a mental thing, but the moon is more of this deep kind of gut knowing kind of quality. So I think that the Cancer person, if they're navigating their life successfully, it all depends, of course, also the dynamics of the chart, but there's an emphasis on getting in tune with this deeper intuitive knowing that we get from the moon and Cancer as a water sign. If you look at some of the dignities of Cancer, there's it's a detriment of Saturn and the fall of Mars. So both the malefics don't do well here, and that also has to do with the rulership of the moon. The moon typically doesn't really, if you were to make an interpretation of a Mars moon transit. Now, like the moon does a complete circle of the zodiac within a month, so the moon's always going to be making these aspects, and sometimes they might not be that serious, but there could be that a moon Mars could represent an injury or an accident or some kind of bodily harm, right? Because Mars is this sort of cutting, breaking, violent kind of force, and the moon represents the body, as I was saying earlier. And or it could also, even if it's your emotional sensitivity, it could be a kind of an emotional injury or something like that. And so the moon is a sensitive, receptive thing, and it's you want it receiving something a bit friendlier than Mars. That's what Mars doesn't do too well with Cancer. And Saturn, if you think about, for example, like the moon as being a significator for the mother, you've got exaltation of Jupiter. Jupiter would indicate more of a kind of abundance, a kind of generosity, a very giving, nurturing. It would enhance that quality of the moon. And it's said to exalt there because Cancer is the peak of the summer. So it kind of represents this peak of abundance that Jupiter just kind of naturally harmonizes with very well. However, if you put Saturn there, Saturn's is the winter kind of planet. It's the opposite kind of principle, and it puts a obstacle or a limit on the nurturing, generous kind of capacity, and it could create this feeling of being emotionally cold or distant or overly serious or solemn, and it could create this, if we're talking about in terms of the mother archetype of it being a kind of a cold or barren or kind of a not very nurturing or friendly mother, and that kind of, but there's all sorts of people out there, obviously, all sorts of different patterns of karma, and for some people, it might be more of a Saturnian mother, or it might be a more Jupiterian mother, or any other of these kinds of archetypal combinations. But the having Saturn in there, or Mars in there, it's seen as especially difficult in this sort of moon sign. whereas as Jupiter is seen to enhance the qualities. Um, if we're looking at the how it connects with like and girding, I'm going with the pair of the sun and the moon here, and this kind of segues into the next one, the second house. Um, there's there's basically, for we can just keep going here. The second house is the wealth and resources that support the native, and it could, and also personal belongings. And you've got Leo, which is a sun ruled sign, and so the sun being usually indicating like the kind of ego focus of the, the heroic ego. There's something about the sun being a significator for this, that the person attaches a kind of self-identity to their belongings, that their belongings or resources say something about the person. And I would just say that's doubled with the like and girding to the first house with the sun and moon pair. That I was thinking that there's a Fugazi song with the lyrics, "You are not what you own," and perhaps that would be a reminder for the Cancer ascendant person, because there could be a lot of identification with the belongings. They're looking, with the Leo quality. If you think about Leo, the sun as being the brightest thing in the sky, this big radiant warm thing, that what they own could perhaps maybe have a flashy quality to it. It could have a very kind of showing off, the bling almost, maybe for some people or something, right? Like you're being very flashy with your possessions and what you have, and that your self-worth is kind of on display in a very literalized sense of I'm worth a lot because look at the stuff that I have that is worth something. I think that, depending on the chart, this may not be emphasized for everybody though, but that's one thing that I get from having a Leo second house, and having that connection with both the sun and the first here. The third house links up with Virgo, and I mean, I always often jump to these like kind of stereotypes with Virgo as being a kind of perfectionistic, kind of nitpicky kind of sign. But if you look at the dignities for Virgo, it's the fall of Venus and it's the detriment of Jupiter. So both the benefics don't do very well in Virgo. And the third house is going to say something about your siblings, your aunts and uncles, your local neighborhood, the people in the local environment. Also has to do maybe with what you do with your hands, with your communication style and stuff like this. And I find that Virgo is the sign that comes at the end of the summer, where it's kind of preparing for the winter, and it's got this preparing for the changes ahead as a kind of a mutable sign. And it's kind of practical and detail oriented, and so that maybe with the relation with the either brothers and sisters or people who play that role or people around, there could be it's not, with the fall of Venus, it's not so amicable and friendly. It seems more kind of like workmanlike, more down to business, more like getting things organized, getting it right. And in some situations, maybe that's helpful. In other situations, maybe it's not so helpful. One of the things I think is interesting about this is that if you look at the like and girding, the other Mercury ruled sign is Gemini, and that's in the 12th house. And the 12th house is the house of self-undoing. So when I'm kind of thinking about this, is that I think Virgo, there's this attitude of really trying to get it right. And sometimes when we try too hard to get it right, we actually get it wrong. I was thinking about this. I mean, I don't know if it's the best thing for use for the third, but I was just thinking as somebody who makes music, like when I first started trying to record my own recordings, one of the things I'd have trouble with is the kind of like the performance anxiety, or I guess anything, just like running up against the obstacle of your own perfectionism, right? Because it's sort of like when you're trying to get everything to be totally perfect, you almost kind of trip yourself up a bit. You can jinx yourself. It's like, so when you're going to record something and you hit record and that pressure's on to get it right, that feels more forced and unnatural than if you just sort of like did it more casually, right? Like maybe if somebody was recording you, you didn't know you were being recorded. It's sort of like you have to be willing to sort of like play a bit more loose with it, right? And I think that being a bit too perfectionistic in how we relate to our 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 connections with the people around us and our day-to-day life and our local environment and stuff like that, like you kind of have to like not be so controlling. Maybe it's a control thing, or is it trying to, you kind of have to let things kind of like go on their own and not have everything fit the schedule or something. You have to have a bit of wiggle room, maybe. This is kind of like what I would get with this, because it connects with the 12th, which is like maybe by trying to be too perfect about everything, that could actually be a source of self undoing. Like you might actually trip yourself up by being too much of a perfectionist. And this could do with, with communicating too, with a third house topic. It could be like if you're going to give a presentation, if you're going to communicate like what I'm doing here, if I'm putting a lot of pressure on myself to get it all perfect, that could actually, I could be tongue tying myself. Maybe that's something. I could be tripping myself up because I'm not relaxed about it. I'm trying to be too much of a perfectionist, and that could come out in communication with as a third house thing with with Virgo here. With Libra in the 4th, I sort of can see some pros and cons coming from this. Libra is a Venus ruled sign, and as such, it could indicate a kind of a positive thing for the family. Of course, Cancer itself is because it has that mother thing going on, it's a very kind of family oriented kind of sign to have the ascendant. With Libra, there's a sort of perhaps a sense of cooperation, and perhaps working with the family, putting the needs of the family as a group above the needs of the individual. And I would come in with that because Libra is a sign that marks it's a cardinal sign marking the fall season, and it is represented by the scales. So it's a kind of like a balancing between the light and the dark, the self and the other, the needs of the self versus the needs of the group, that kind of thing. And so I think if Venus, the ruler of the 4th, is doing pretty well, it could indicate a kind of a harmonious, cooperative kind of family dynamic. But I think this also has its own shadow side as well. I mean, you could look at a kind of typical situation could be if there's, let's say, a fight or a divorce in the family, that the child could very much feel in the middle of that, as feeling like it's their job to kind of mediate conflicts in the family and be a kind of a peacekeeper, and that their own kind of emotional survival is kind of tied in with mediating the problems of either the parents or whatever else is going on in the home life. And it could be some difficulty kind of individuating out of that, because there kind of wrapped up in it or something. I mean, I'm kind of spinning off into interpretations here. I mean, it all depends on the actual chart, but this could be kind of like the shadow side of the Libras. It could be things like codependent relationships and that kind of stuff. But I think that if you look at how it connects with like and girding to the 11th house, that you get a positive thing happening there, because the 11th house is the house of good spirit. It's the house that of what's ultimately supports the native in realizing their goals and ambitions. It's represents the kind of friends and allies of the native. And so there could be some sort of, like, if you look at a mundane reading of this, of course it depends on the chart, but there could be strong connections between the family and, let's say, a family friend who's well hooked up that really helps out the native. Or it could be that the family themselves could bring in this sort of helping, friendly, assisting quality. And this is also emphasized by the fact that the connection is happening between two Venus signs. It's going to be Taurus in the 11th connecting with Libra in the 4th. And so there's, even though I think this, it has its potential for its own shadow qualities, that I think there's generally an encouraging dynamic here between the 4th and the 11th. Ultimately, when reading a chart, it depends on what is actually happening in the chart, though. But as a basic kind of blueprint, it's kind of interesting to look at. So the 5th house is connected with Scorpio. This is kind of an interesting one, because I mean, it's hard to think of this for me without getting into these sort of like heavy sexual kind of themes. The 5th house is being the house of pleasure, and basically what you do for fun, how you enjoy yourself, what you do with your free time. And when Scorpio's there, Scorpio kind of has this like steamy, heavy kind of quality, being this feminine Mars sign. And maybe the person, I just think of like the sort of like, maybe the person has like sort of naughty, kinky, like or it could also be like what they what kind of books the person reading. It could be, it's not going to be just light stuff. It could be something that has like really intense brooding qualities. Or maybe they like, Scorpio is the Halloween sign. Maybe it takes on a different quality. Maybe the person really likes, if they knock off work, what do they do for fun? Maybe they like watching horror movies or something, right? They like that or they like the Edgar Allan Poe kind of thing. It's like poetry that brings out this sort of dark, the Raven kind of Scorpio quality in their self-expression or what they enjoy, and that kind of thing. And this connects with the 10th house. So depending if the 10th and the 5th are emphasized in the Cancer rising chart, that could say something about what their they could be they could become famous for doing this kind of work or something. Or this element could be accentuated in what they're doing, perhaps as a job. But I don't know. With this, it would all depend on the chart. I don't know if the charts I have are going to be the best example of this dynamic. But yeah, it would be interesting to take a closer look and see if you can see these themes coming out in the Cancer rising person. So the 6th house is the house that's to do with service, labor, subordinates, things like that, and it matches up with Sagittarius. And I think the biggest, most obvious connection we can get from this one is if you take Jupiter as being a kind of religious, higher authority kind of planet, and putting that in the 6th, is that it emphasizes the spiritual nature of service. And this can take many different shapes. I think in our culture, we often see it as this kind of like Protestant work ethic, which, I mean, regardless of what your opinions and beliefs are, think there's some questionable things about it, but it's like that like you're meant to be a hard worker in this lifetime, and we're not meant to seek pleasure and that's all for what our life in heaven kind of thing. And that meanwhile, while we're in we're here to be in service and to be good dutiful workers. And you see a lot of these sort of like moralistic fairy tales. That's not the Sagittarius sixth house person is going to there's going to be a kind of a moral thing about hard work, whereas the person who slacks off and is lazy is seen as fundamentally out of whack with the order of the cosmos, the higher order as represented by Jupiter. And that the ultimate expression of this altruistic generosity loving planet is to be generous in your labor, be generous in your servitude. This is kind of what comes from, I think, a yang Jupiter Sagittarius with a sixth. And the sixth is the joy of Mars, and Mars is kind of seen as being the effort put into the hard work. And when you put that in with Jupiter, it kind of, Jupiter is an expanding planet, and it kind of expands that beyond into having a higher kind of spiritual or moral significance. And I think this is even just doubled by the fact that if you look at the Lichen girding, what does it match up with? It matches up with the ninth house, which is the house of philosophy and religion and higher understanding. That there's a strong connection, that it's like karma yoga, that your understanding, your knowledge of God is directly tied to how are you in service to God, and that are you generous in your service to God. This is all very, depending on the person, maybe not everybody as a Cancer rising will think about it in these terms, right? This is I'm taking a kind of emphasized religious description of this right now. But that's the theme that I see coming out in this. I think I'll move on here. I think that does a good job of explaining this general theme. The seventh house. The seventh house is always interesting because I always bring it back to the basic quality of opposition between the first and the seventh. And I've seen it suggested that when it comes to this idea of, let's say, the compensation of the partner, is that a person, this is the whole thing of the opposites attract between the first and the seventh, is that if the person is more identified as a Cancer kind of person, maybe that's the nurturing, mothering kind of type. What is seen as the opposite to that is the Capricorn, which is perhaps more of a dutiful, hardworking kind of type. That's less about the emotional supportiveness and more about maybe let's get down to work kind of thing. And so the more the person is going to be more of that emotionally supportive kind of thing, the partner may have a more colder, stricter, down to business kind of attitude that's emphasized in the kind of the contrast of the opposites represented in these signs. And this is kind of interesting too, because like Capricorn is the detriment of the moon, the fall of Jupiter. It's very opposite to what Cancer is like. And I think one thing that I have noticed is that I think that if you're looking at this basic scheme where you're looking at the rulerships of the houses indicated by this ascendant position, that the Saturn ruled signs, in this case it's the 7th and the 8th house, when they're ruled by Saturn, it can indicate more of a source of difficulty, and it's quite possible that Cancer rising may be prone to more difficulty with their partners or this topic of relationships and partnership in general, based on the fact that Saturn is ruling that house for them. And Saturn is a planet which doesn't really match up very well with the seventh house. I mean, in one sense it would match up, because it could emphasize the sense of like a commitment, right? The you're making a lifelong commitment to be with somebody, and there's a sort of, it takes work, hard work and sacrifice, and these kinds of, it's a very Saturnian kind of dynamic with relationship. And it's and this kind of ties in with the Lycan girding with the eighth. Maybe we can use this to segue onto the eighth. The eighth has to do with death, loss, inheritance, shared finances, and so the eighth and the seventh are both ruled by Saturn signs. There could be the sort of, it could come out in different ways. Like maybe the relationship with the partner has a strong emphasis on, shared resources. Like it's like, but it can be a bit cold though, right? Like if you're just married, we're getting married for tax purposes, right? Or I'm just marrying this person so I get citizenship to this country. Or maybe it's like, it's mutually beneficial, but it doesn't have this sort of like the spark of, it has more to do with fitting into some kind. It could be like a traditional marriage that your parents approve of and is practical, but it doesn't have this like, it feels a bit cold. It doesn't have this passionate dynamic. That's what you might expect from having Saturn ruling both of these signs. It could also be, in some cases, maybe if the partner hasn't really got their shit together, maybe the person is sacrificing a lot to the relationship. And I think with the eighth and the seventh connection, there could be an emphasis around sacrifice in relationship, compromise in relationship. You maybe would be easier to go it alone, and it's actually you're taking something on. It could be a benefit, could not be, but the Saturn here, I think, definitely does emphasize some of the difficulties. But with Aquarius has to do with, again, this emphasis on the service kind of thing. It's sort of making a sacrifice of yourself to something perhaps bigger and better. And it could, maybe the person could be rationalizing it as in like, oh, I'm making a lot of compromises or sacrifices, but this is important to me, and it just shows that I care, or that I'm making a long-term investment in the relationship. I'm playing it for the long game. I'm trying to find something that lasts or something, right? And this could emphasize that kind of nature of the commitment around relationship, perhaps. With ninth house and Pisces, it's an interesting combination. Ninth house is the house of God and religion and philosophy, higher learning. And with Pisces, it's interesting because there's an association with Christianity, the fish symbol, and the fish symbol in Pisces. And Carl Jung went into this in his book Aeon. I can't say I've read the whole thing. It's kind of a difficult read, I must say, but I haven't dove too far into it. And there's also perhaps a debate to have about whether the whole thing about the precession of the equinoxes is really a valid concept, because I think it only came about more recently. It's not really an ancient concept. And I think that Jung's connection with it was sort of like Christ as being the prophet of the age of Pisces, and then moving into the age of Aquarius, we're going to have our Aquarian prophet or something like this, right? But I think there's a kind of, Pisces is a feminine Jupiter sign, and Jupiter definitely brings out this kind of it's, if the ninth is the house of God, Jupiter represents kind of the Christian image of God, as in God as the benefic force, God as love, as opposed to the fire and brimstone Old Testament God, which is probably a bit more of a Saturn one, right? So there's something about the Pisces has this quality of compassion. It is the exaltation of Venus, and but I think it's also important to keep in mind, as we mentioned earlier, there's this connection between the ninth and the sixth. The other Jupiter ruled sign, Sagittarius, in the sixth. So there's something about this, the service, that the ultimate compassion and generosity is perhaps measured in some way, or there's a sense of it being measured by how you're in service. And I think that a possible danger here comes out in the Pisces tendency towards what would be a kind of martyr complex of martyrdom, being so self-sacrificing, right? And I mean, this is another, that in itself could be a rich topic for discussion. But I think those themes you kind of see when you not just looking at putting together Pisces in the ninth, but how it's implied with the Sagittarius in the sixth. It kind of brings out this thing that there could be a very deep, giving, compassionate, caring for the fellow man, and that is ultimately what the message of spirituality and the higher wisdom is. But even that too can be something that we get hooked into. We get hooked into a more of a one-sided idea of that takes, it's not really true, right? It's like it could be a bit lopsided into this idea of being ultimately being self-sacrificing, being putting compassion for others above oneself, in this kind of like the transcendent kind of thing. And it's like, I don't, I get the whole question of like, whether is it really the healthiest ideal to be like, bearing the cross on your back, to be suffering, and but I mean, that's a deeper spiritual message in a lot of things, is that the ultimate like insight, the ultimate realization doesn't happen from struggle at being at odds against suffering, but is actually like a direct result of that, right? So there could be like a kind of an alchemy at work that you can see in the Cancer rising chart, and the alchemy is very much tied in with the sixth, which could have to do with labor and toil, and from kind of submitting to that ties in with this sort of a yin ninth house, right? It's like a kind of, maybe the yang comes out in the active work of the sixth. It could be hard work that you really have to put that muscle into, but by submitting to that is a kind of opens up this yin receptive ninth house, which really points to, I think, some of the mysterious, that nighttime. It's the night home of Jupiter, so it's a sort of expansive, getting the dream world, it's a very, very mystical kind of ninth house placement, I think, in the Cancer rising chart, which is interesting. And being a bit of a contrast here now, you go, the contrast point of the Pisces towards Aries, transitioning out of winter into spring. Basically, I mean, for 10th house, this is the person, what they do for work, their kind of reputation. They could have a very assertive kind of quality for their professional life and what they do. And also it all depends on the chart. I'll use some charts as examples of this. I'm thinking I'm gonna do Ram Dass's chart. And he's got a sun in Aries. So he's got the 10th house Aries sun in its exaltation. And as we know, he was very famous for what he was doing. He was had a huge public figure in terms of both spirituality and the psychedelic movement. So if somebody's got is a 10th house Aries sun that's well supported by the other aspects in the chart, it could indicate quite a bit of fame here, because it gives that exaltation of the sun in Aries there being in that angular position. It could be very strong. And I mean, that whole cardinal quality too is kind of like the person's not only famous, but they're famous for kind of like, if you think about the transition from winter into spring, there's often this sense of a sharp change, right? Like it was a dreary winter, but wow, look, the sun's really out, spring's really here. Like that's the sudden cardinal kind of quality that they may bring that to their professional impact, how they make a mark on society or something like this. And as we mentioned before, it connects with the Scorpio 5th house. So it could tie in with something of what they do for fun, but it has that Mars quality to it, right? So there's a sense of that passion though, that Mars kind of juice that comes from either follow your bliss might be something that's kind of accentuated with this. There's a certain active kind of alive energy and passion, I think, from this kind of placement of Aries in the 10th, and connecting with that kind of 5th house Scorpio, that there's kind of that vital libidinal kind of thing coming out too, maybe. Taurus with the 11th. One thing about Taurus is that it's a fixed sign. I'm thinking, I'm going to use my sister as a Taurus. I'm going to use her as an example here, but she like watches the same movies like that she's watched as a kid, and watches like, Harry Potter, rewatch the whole Harry Potter series every year kind of thing. So this has to do with the fixed quality of Taurus. There's a sense of like consistency and maybe like repetition, but the 11th house is the house that has to do with friends and allies. So the people in that role are going to have that Taurus fixed kind of quality, that there might be some like staple allies that are with the Cancer rising native for their life, like a kind of a long-term supportive quality. And the fact that this is a Venus ruled sign is helpful, because you've got the house of good spirit, this sort of assisting, kind of like the guardian angel quality associated with the benefic planet is a nice match there. So if Venus is well dignified, that could be very favorable for the person in terms of the help they get to reach their goals. This is, as we discussed earlier, it's connected to the 4th house, so there could be a connection there with family, maybe some benefits from family friends, or the family playing a supportive role themselves. It's the exaltation of the moon, so an exalted moon in the 11th would be it would be very fortunate, because the moon, it would kind of amplify the moon's significator as general fortune, and good luck and stuff like that. But yeah, again, it all depends on the chart, but it's a nice one to have. The 12th house is associated with Gemini, which is interesting. I think last time I talked a bit about the trickster archetype of Gemini, and while that might work in favor for a Gemini rising, for a Cancer rising person, the Gemini has moved into the 12th, and that could be a source of trouble. And so you think about Gemini, the twins, maybe like the two-faced, the inconsistencies, the person might get in trouble for being contradictory, or being saying one thing and doing another, or not holding other people to other standards than themselves, or giving false pretenses, or something like that, or any sort of, if the person's trying to be a bit too clever, I think they can pull one over on somebody. The Cancer ascendant wouldn't make a very good con man. They might get to only trip themselves up by trying to play games with other people. I think this is all kind of themes that I'd get from Gemini in the 12th. It connects with the third house. So it also emphasizes trouble. This could be part of the trouble with siblings, or with the kind of people you have a neighborly relationship with. There could be this kind of like maybe the two-faced duplicitous. I'm not really pronouncing that. That duplicity, like having the Jekyll and Hyde, or the superficial, not that authentic. You kind of put on different masks in different situations, and people might start to question, what's your true motives, or something like that. This could come up with this Gemini 12th house stuff. So here we have the natal chart of Albert Einstein. And there's some interesting things going on in this chart, but to start off, we've got the ascendant in Cancer, is why I've chosen this chart for matching the Cancer ascendant, and we look at the 9th house Pisces for his sun there, and as the 9th house as being if the 10th is more of like the actions in the day-to-day world, the 9th house is more of like the scholarly study. It's a bit more theoretical, whereas the 10th house is more of the action or the praxis. The 9th house is more theoretical, and as such, for somebody who is one of the biggest names in theoretical physics, it's makes sense to find Einstein's sun in that 9th house Pisces. And I think that it's fair to say too that some of those achievements and the breakthroughs of science tie in with mystical understanding. I think Einstein himself was kind of famous for tapping into his more intuitive thinking to help with those kind of breakthrough insights that he had. And you do see that with the lichen girding. You see the moon here in the 6th house, the other Jupiter ruled sign. So you have both the sun and the moon in Jupiter signs in a square to each other. So this is the last quarter waning moon. And so that's kind of highlighting maybe that the work, the getting down to business with the studying and putting the work in, and the what comes of that. Now, I think there's something interesting though, because of course a lot of what came of his work had to do with the war. As I also should say with the 9th house, is that he not only did he travel a lot, but because the Second World War broke out while he was traveling, he decided just not to come back to Germany. He was from a Jewish family, so it would probably be in his best interest to stay the hell out of Germany during that time, and he became an American citizen. So with the 9th house also having to do with those kinds of topics of travel abroad and maybe living abroad in a foreign country, that also is perhaps very suitable for that 9th house sun here. The thing is, one of the most interesting things that I've noticed in this chart, though, is that if you go to the 10th house, Aries here, you've got, it doesn't look very good, to be honest. You've got Saturn in its fall in 10th house Aries, and this is kind of a running theme. I wonder what it is about the Saturn in its fall in Aries, but I've been using a lot of charts that have this in it, and here Einstein has it in its 10th house. Herman Melville also had this Saturn in its fall in Aries, and same with Hunter S. Thompson. 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 And s so it's not, it's a kind of unfortunate place for Saturn to be. But then if you go and look, say, okay, well, what rules Aries? Mars rules Aries. So let's see where Mars is. Oh, Mars is in Saturn's sign. So there's a kind of a mutual reception there between Saturn and Mars, and actually Mars is exalted in Saturn's sign. So Mars is actually pretty well dignified here. Um, However, it's the malefic contrary to the sect in favor. This is a day chart, so Mars is Mars is a difficult planet in a day chart, especially above the horizon, like this, out of sect. But it's exalted in Capricorn, and that's giving a bit of a boost to that Saturn in Aries, because Mars is in a somewhat of a strong position, although it's not really playing for the same team as the daytime chart. It's a night sect planet. Um, and likewise here, Venus is in Mars' sign, so Venus is detrimented. Um, Mercury is coming into a conjunction with Saturn, and the part of fortune is right there, just a degree away from Mercury, 2 degrees away from Saturn. Um, and so it's kind of interesting that somebody who, well, I mean, you have to look at the legacy that Einstein left behind, because he was ultimately, obviously, a very successful scientist. But looking at the chart here, it aside I think Mars exalted gives it a bit of a boost, but it's not in sect. It's not the favorable sect. Um, and so ultimately it's kind of a troubled outcome here, I would say, right? A troubled um, what the public what the karma, what the karmic result of the chart is, as indicated by the 10th. um, and that could be because Einstein, even though he said he held views of being a pacifist, he kind of played a role in the development of nuclear weapons in the Manhattan Project and stuff like that. And if there's something, perhaps that Saturn in its fall in Aries could have something to do with that nuclear, the god of war Mars, and the Saturn, the god of death, and that in being, that bad match of, combination of a bad match between Mars and Saturn, but then being augmented by the good match of Mars being exalted over there in Capricorn, kind of mitigating the badness of it, so that ultimately maybe there's a success in his legacy, but that it has a complex dynamic with these issues of Mars and Saturn and Venus, ultimately, who would represent the peacekeeper. We're fighting for peace, as much of that's a contradiction, but that's kind of the Mars Venus dynamic. Venus is ultimately kind of suffering, I would say, in this position. That it's sort of, the thing is that when you're trying, if you think that a nuclear bomb is going to help to put an end to war and suffering, it's sort of like, is that really, you start to wonder if that's really the price to pay here. And I find that's fascinating about the astrology, is that it's kind of a complex moral problem, and it's in that complexity is kind of, you can see it in the chart with a fallen Saturn, a detrimented Venus, Mercury running right into that, right on the right around the part of fortune. It's like, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I think it's definitely something to kind of ponder about. And if anybody had any comments to be made on this one, I'd be interested to hear what you'd have to say. Another thing about this is that I think with Einstein, at least I didn't know much about Einstein's like marriage or anything like that. It doesn't seem like it's the part of his what he's famous for that gets a lot of attention. But to look into that topic, it said that he got married to a woman named Merrick in 1903, but apparently it said that The couple moved to Berlin in 1914, but Merrick returned to Zurich after with their sons after learning that Einstein's chief romantic attraction was his first and second cousin Elsa, which is kind of weird. And then they divorce in 1919, having lived apart for 5 years. So there's a divorce, and I think he ultimately ends up with his cousin. So I mean, I don't know, make of that what you will. But there also this stuff about how his son that he had a breakdown with schizophrenia, and I don't. This is another interesting thing. I wonder if that's the connections between the whole madness and genius thing. Is that like, do you think there's some connection with Einstein and the kind of the gifts that he had, and then as that being in the lineage of that coming out, maybe for some people it can be a benefit, but for other people that same family daimon, if you want to talk about it like that, can be destructive. And that we're talking about the dangerous gifts kind of quality. I wonder if that is an apparently in his the mother, though it could have also been something to do with the mother's side, as she was also committed to asylums. So I think that at least is something interesting to consider. Um, and especially it's a bit strange about marrying the cousin thing. But if you go back to the chart here, you look at that Mars in the seventh, right? So it's exalted Mars, but it's the malefic contrary to the sect in favor. So it's going to create some problems in the seventh house, and that could be seen as the breakup, the divorce of the marriage. And then if you see, okay, what other planet, what does Mars rule? It rules the 10th, which we already talked about. It also rules the fifth house, the Scorpio. And so that, that could also play into the schizophrenic breakdown of his son. You could see that as having that Mars in the seventh causing some kind of trouble, connecting also with that Saturn fallen in Aries, all that kind of stuff. It creates a complicated dynamic, and I'm just sort of showing this for your consideration. So here we have Ram Dass. Ram Dass's chart, also known as Richard Alpert, his birth name. This is kind of an interesting chart to look at because there's a lot of things going on with the dignities of planet here. You've got exalted Jupiter in Cancer. You've got Saturn in its own domicile in Capricorn. You've got exalted Sun in Aries. You've got exalted Venus in Pisces. It's a pretty strong chart, really. So I'm assuming people are already familiar with Ram Dass. I'm not going to give the longest explanation of his story, but he first came to prominence as being a friend of Tim Leary's in the 1960s, initial LSD experimentation, and eventually he kind of dropped out of the psychedelic scene and got more into Eastern spirituality. He spent a lot of time in India with his guru Neem Karoli Baba, and eventually came back to write Be Here Now, and he's been a spiritual teacher his whole life. Even after a stroke that he had more recently, he still continues teaching. And so there's certain things that we could look at here. The sun at the 10th house is on its own something that's going to signify probably some fame and public attention. When you put it together with the North Node, as well as Uranus being there, it's right conjunct Uranus, and Uranus is that, I mean, we're getting to modern planets here, so I'm not strictly Hellenistic, but Uranus has to do with this sort of revolutionary breakthrough, and to be a figurehead of the psychedelic movement, and also kind of breaking through that whole interest in things like meditation and devotional spirituality in the 1960s, playing a major force of that, and it really being a big thing with that North Node expanding, growing kind of influence. You can see that all with a lot of, being emphasized in that strong 10th house position. And that's also getting a trine aspect from the moon in the sixth. And remember, I was talking about that whole thing of the service, right? Like, he wrote a book called "How Can I Help," and he was very into. He came from a wealthy family, and so to put his maybe to put his money where his mouth is, or spent a lot of time and energy on these different charitable projects. Um, the seventh house, seventh house has to do with relationships, but it could also do with the one-on-one relationship with the guru, right? And you've got the Saturn in its own domicile in Capricorn, and that could emphasize the guru relationship with the older wise man of his Maharaji, or as you'd call him, right? And you see that being the opposite to Cancer, which you've got the exalted Jupiter. Now, and that's getting a trine from Venus, an exalted Venus in Pisces, right? That exalted Venus in Pisces in the ninth as being a very mystical kind of ninth house, and Venus being like the friend planet. It could also show something for the spiritual teacher, the spiritual friend showing up exalted in that mystical Pisces ninth house, giving a nice supportive trine to its own domicile lord, in exalted in Cancer, not too far away from the ascendant, right? So this is a very powerful chart for Ram Dass. He's also got Pluto right conjunct the ascendant degree, assuming that this is a nicely accurate birth time. And I mean, Ram Dass, he was also shaking things up a bit because he's was bisexual. He said he doesn't really like to label it, but he didn't fit the conventional heteronormative gender thing, and perhaps that Pluto on the ascendant might have something to do with the breaking the taboos, and also the breaking the taboos around psychedelics or different spiritual styles that may have been foreign to the culture at the time, perhaps. The foreign travel of the ninth, and the Venus, the friendly Venus planet being there, accentuating that too. So yeah, there's lots going on here, but I thought I don't want to spend all day going into these charts, but there's definitely some cool stuff to look at in Ram Dass's chart.